Fantastic Beasts 2: The Crimes of Grindelwald is the worst movie that I watched last year.
Crimes of Grindelwald is one of the most aimless and confusing and nonsensical movies I've seen in a very long time.
Fantastic Beasts 2 is regarded by most as the worst film associated with the Harry Potter IP.
I'm really not sure if I've been let down more by a blockbuster all year.
Hating the Crimes of Grindelwald has sort of become this trend online, and the decline of J.K. Rowling at the time of its release made this 10 times worse. I've been planning this video for a while, but before I start, I feel I need to address the elephant in the room and talk about my opinions on J.K. Rowling, because in this video, I will be praising her, but I'm not praising her for the person she is. I'm praising her about her art and her art alone. I tweeted a long statement about my feelings on JK's personal opinions. If you want to see it, it's linked below, but I don't want to get into that in this video. Now that that's out of the way, let's move on. I just made a video on why I thought the first Fantastic Beasts film was actually a really great movie, and in the comments, many people agreed. However, in that comment section, people already began to bash on the sequel. When The Crimes of Grindelwald first came out, I went to see the movie at its midnight premiere. Before going, I did not go on social media whatsoever. I sat down, watched the film for what it was, and I made a review on it where I said I actually liked it. After posting the video, I went on social media for the first time since seeing the movie, and I was actually pretty surprised to see how much hate it was getting. Over the next few months, I'm embarrassed to say that I actually let the public's opinion sway my own personal opinions on this film, and even on the first film, because all of a sudden, people were not only hating on this movie, but they hated the first one as well, even though most people said good things about it back when it first came out. I'm sad to say that I'm one of those people, but as I said in my video for the first Fantastic Beasts film, I decided to revisit these movies. I sat down, watched it in my home theater to get the full experience, watching it the way it's supposed to be watched, and while watching I was like, damn, this isn't that bad. When I tweeted this, however, a lot of people disagreed, which only got me more hyped to make this video.
Beautiful.
I did a lot to prepare for this video essay. I went through too many reviews to count, looked at forums online, and even looked at my fellow YouTubers' videos that bashed this film. I've put together a list of the 6 biggest things that people complain about in this movie, and I'm going to go through each one and explain why these opinions might be sort of invalid. Obviously, it's okay if you disagree with me. I know a lot of people are going to write me off before even watching the video, and that's okay. Everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but my goal here is to hopefully shed some light on why this movie doesn't deserve all the hate it gets. Let's start with the thing that people criticize the most, the characters. Grindelwald seems to be the biggest topic of discussion, which is fitting because he's the person the film is named after. He's the main villain in the series, and I've seen a lot of people say that Grindelwald isn't a good person to base a film series around. I completely disagree. I think he's the perfect villain to base this series around, because he's already an existing character that ties this prequel series to the original series, and he's already known for being one of, if not the most dangerous wizarding tyrants in history. The perfect person to follow, or in this case, precede a villain like Voldemort. And not only does he tie us to the original series in a perfect way, but he's the key to one of the most interesting plot lines in the original series, Dumbledore's past, something that we got some information on in the 7 books, but left us wanting more, setting this prequel series up perfectly, and it's all thanks to Grindelwald, who's at the center of this conflict. But the main reason why Grindelwald is so great is because he's not just another Voldemort. He's more black and white. We know how he dies. He refuses to help Voldemort find the Elder Wand and defile Dumbledore's tomb. He sees the error of his ways and he dies protecting Dumbledore and helping the good guys. In The Crimes of Grindelwald, Rowling touches on these two villains' differences in many ways, though some people just didn't seem to pick up on it, which sort of shocked me. The biggest and one of my favorite examples of Rowling separating Grindelwald from Voldemort is actually one of the most talked about and hated scenes, Grindelwald killing a baby.
And then he kills a baby. 15 minutes into my Harry Potter movie and we've killed our first baby.
The thing is, he didn't kill the baby. In fact, he couldn't even watch while it happened. This was Rowling showing a true distinction between Grindelwald and Voldemort, as Voldemort didn't even give killing a baby a second thought. This scene wasn't just thrown in there for the hell of it. It has true meaning behind it, and the fact that this went over so many people's heads blows my mind. And in this film, there are other examples of Grindelwald being different from Voldemort. One, he saves the man that helped him escape custody, something that Voldemort would have never done. He also sets his followers straight when she talks about taking all of the non-magical down.
We don't say such things out loud. We want only freedom.
There is a line that Grindelwald does not cross, a line that Voldemort completely ignores. That being said, though Grindelwald is not as bad as Voldemort, he's still pretty bad. People have gone on and on about how in his speech, Grindelwald talked about not being violent and how the Aurors were the ones that were violent, but then he goes ahead and almost burns Paris to the ground.
Grindelwald summons elemental dragons to destroy Paris, even though the whole reason he was here was to convince people that he isn't a violent maniac.
They say he contradicted himself, but again, this went over people's heads. He isn't a hypocrite, he's a genius, a manipulative genius. We see this from the very first scene of this movie. They said that they had to change his guards multiple times and cut his tongue out because he was so good at manipulating them.
We've had to change his guard 3 times. He's very persuasive.
He's a masterful liar, saying whatever needs to be said to get people to do what he wants. So even though he says he doesn't believe in violence, he's just bullshitting everybody to get them on his side. That's the whole point of his character. He's literally a hero to his followers because he tells them what they want to hear.
His message is very seductive. They see Grindelwald as their hero.
And this is not the first time we've seen this either. We watched him manipulate Credence during the entire first movie, and we saw how skilled he was at saying what needed to be said as he posed as one of the most important MACUSA employees right under the president's nose. And the streak only continues more and more in this movie. He kills who has to be killed in order to get Credence on his side. He pays off who has to be paid off to do it. He lies to who he has to get what he wants, and he does all of this in a brilliant way. Of course Grindelwald is violent, he just makes it look like he's not to his followers. He turns the tables and makes himself come out as the good guy instead of the bad. A true sign of how skilled he is when shaping the public's view of himself. Dumbledore knew he was gonna do just that, and that's why he told Theseus not to have the Aurors come to his rally. Dumbledore might be the only person who has Grindelwald's number, so those saying that Grindelwald always contradicts himself is the weakest argument I've ever heard. That's the whole point. He's literally based on dictators who have had the same effect on people in real life, like Adolf Hitler, Julius Caesar, and so many more. Another character that has gotten bashed on in this movie is Newt.
I mean, surely Newt, our lead, has interesting character traits to spare. I just don't like this character.
People say that Newt, a simple magizoologist, wouldn't realistically be involved in these government problems. He's just some dude who wrote a book.
Why Newt? He is just a zookeeper. At this rate, they could get any other wizard to do this stuff instead of him. I'm sure there's plenty of skilled wizards who would be glad to help out.
But did everybody forget that he was the one who caught Grindelwald in the last movie, and that he was the one who discovered that Graves was actually Grindelwald when a whole squad of Aurors and the MACUSA president couldn't do either of these things? Newt cemented himself in this conflict when he took Grindelwald down in the last movie. Remember the stare down the two characters had? Grindelwald knows Newt and hates him, and rightly so, because Newt proved himself to be a worthy adversary. And on top of that, he's not a nobody, he's famous. His book is a bestseller, and he's so big that there are even tabloids about him.
Price of fame, pal.
And if that wasn't enough to tie Newt to this conflict, Dumbledore chose Newt for very specific reasons that is not only telling to Dumbledore's character and past, but to how unique Newt is. He chose Newt because Newt does not seek power.
Do you know why I admire you, Newt? You do not seek power.
The very thing that we know Dumbledore struggled with during his quest to find the Deathly Hallows, something that cost him his little sister. This is why Dumbledore never took on the Minister of Magic job, despite so many people asking him to do so. He knew he couldn't handle the power, which is why he has so much admiration for Newt. Another character that gets crapped on a lot in this movie is Leta Lestrange. Leta is actually one of my favorite characters in this movie. I find her very compelling and super interesting to watch. I even made a video breaking her character down days after seeing this movie for the first time. People say that she served no real purpose in this movie because she just died in the end without having done anything.
She just dies for no reason.
Again, I don't think this is entirely true. Leta serves some huge purposes in the story. One, her family tree and her lost brother are one of the main conflicts in this movie, and this storyline serves much of the rising action in the film, but this is something I'm going to talk about more later on in the video once we get to the writing structure section. The second reason why Leta is important is the fact that she expands on Dumbledore's character a great deal. The two have paralleling stories. They both feel extreme guilt for losing their little sibling. The conversation that Lita and Dumbledore have is perhaps the most interesting one in the film, and we get a look into how Dumbledore deals with the guilt of losing Ariana. And I'm going to come back to this scene, again when we get to the writing structure part of the video. The third reason why Lita is so important is because of her death. Most fans are almost certain that Lita saying I love you to Newt and Theseus proves that she loves them and sacrificed herself to save them. Sound familiar? It should, because that's exactly what Lily Potter did for Harry, which led to the love protection. Lita's sacrifice is most likely going to lead to a love protection that goes over Newt or Theseus or both of them, and is something that's going to have a huge impact on the story to come. She will be the Lily Potter of the story. Gone, but her death changing everything. And the final point I'll make about the characters being hated on is the complaint that the characters aren't the same from the first film, especially the 4 main heroes. But looking deeper, Tina is still her same old self, going out and taking the law into her own hands by hunting Credence. Jacob is still his same old New Yorker self, still amazed by magic and just happy to be there. And Newt is still his same old goofy, awkward self, licking the ground, interacting weirdly with his creatures, and saying weird and uncomfortable things that only Newt would say.
She has eyes just like a salamander.
Don't say that.
The only character that might have changed a bit is Queenie. That's a valid argument, because she did change a lot, basically date raping Jacob with a love potion, and joining Grindelwald in the end. But those saying that Queenie was too easily manipulated to Grindelwald's side when she was a mind reader might actually be wrong about that.
I'd like to remind you guys that she can read minds. For someone who reads minds, she is very easily swayed by lies and dishonesty.
JK stated, though Queenie can read minds, she doesn't always draw the right conclusions from what she's reading. The fact that she can read Grindelwald's mind might have made her misread what he was thinking, and that's why she joined him and why she was able to walk through the fire without being burned. I'm interested to see where her character goes from here, but I think people jumping to conclusions about her character might be a bit premature. Going off that, it's time to talk about the thing that every Harry Potter fan has talked about non-stop for this movie, how this movie retcons. If you don't know what this term means, the definition of retcon is when a movie or show adds a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events, typically used to facilitate a dramatic plot shift or account for an inconsistency. So basically, when a movie contradicts old information. People have come up with many examples of retconning in this movie, and I'm going to go over each point. I've talked about Dumbledore being gay before, and this time I'm going to do it a bit more calmly. Rowling has gotten so much hate for this, and for those saying that she made Dumbledore and Grindelwald being gay up recently, you are dead wrong.
Now, why didn't she just say so in the books? Well, because he wasn't gay in the books. She changed her mind later.
Rowling announced this a few months after she released The Deathly Hallows. This was in 2007, before Pottermore, before she even joined Twitter, and before of all the JK Rowling hate. Though some things she has tweeted might be sort of awful, this was one announcement that I think was truly from the heart. If you don't believe me, I made an entire video about their gay relationship, proving that they really are gay, that Grindelwald gave his life to protect the man he loved in Dumbledore, and Dumbledore crying when he found this out, so happy that the love of his life finally saw the light. She always intended Dumbledore to be gay. If you've read The Deathly Hallows, and even given any thought to Dumbledore and Grindelwald's relationship, it would be clear to you that the two of them had a romantic relationship. One, all you have to do is infer. Come on guys, we learned to do this in like 2nd grade. The reason she didn't say it outright in the book is because she thought you would be smart enough to grasp it. 2, it's just like real life. Dumbledore being gay doesn't define him, it doesn't change the person he is. This didn't come out of nowhere. I'm honestly surprised so many people didn't know that Rowling announced this 11 years before this movie, but there's a bunch of people that think this was a recent announcement to make the Harry Potter franchise more diverse.
Recently, for example, she was letting everyone know that Dumbledore and Grindelwald have or had an intense sexual love relationship.
Dumbledore being gay is not a retcon. Moving on. Credence suddenly being alive is a point that I've seen many people use as an argument of Rowling just coming up with stuff to make the plot of the next film work. But this is a complaint that I cannot even believe I saw as much as I did.
Also, remember Credence dying? Well, this movie barely does. He's back, and he's more important than ever.
And to top off the stupidity, it's revealed that Ezra Miller survived exploding in the last movie.
We literally saw Credence escape in the last movie. It was a small detail, blink and you'll miss it, but it was there.
Actually,
Rowling didn't just say, hey, I think I'll bring a dead character back for plot convenience. No, she had it planned from day one. As for Credence being a Dumbledore, let's just go back to what I was saying about Grindelwald earlier. He lies and manipulates to get what he wants. He's clearly lying, and if he's not, then f me. But I truly believe that Grindelwald is just lying to Credence to get him on his side. It's what he did for the entire first movie, manipulate and take advantage of Credence. If it's true, then yes, this would retcon previous information, because fans have deduced that Mr. Dumbledore, Albus Dumbledore's father, was in Azkaban when Credence would have been conceived. I guess he could have shacked up in prison, but I find that pretty unlikely considering how Dementors make you feel. So I think he's lying and this is not a retcon. Now let's go over the retcon of Jacob remembering everything from the last movie.
You were supposed to have been obliviated. It didn't work, pal.
But you said it. The potion only erases bad memories. I didn't have any.
In my research online, I saw a bunch of people saying that Rowling just pulled this out of her ass so that Jacob could return for this movie.
But no, he's fine now. I guess that didn't matter.
But there's something I'm going to point out from the last movie that shows how much Rowling planned and how she knew Jacob was going to have his memory back in this movie from day one. I talked about this a bit in my last video, but I'll go into more detail here. When Langdon Shaw sees magic, he's extremely happy because it's the first time his father sees he's right about something when his father has disregarded him all his life and earlier in the film. Because Langdon is happy when he sees magic, he too will remember magic like Jacob, and he will most likely play a big part in the films to come. This just proves that Rowling always has the future of her stories planned, and it proves that she's not just pulling stuff out of her ass. People need to give her the benefit of the doubt and allow her to tell the whole story of this 5-film series before we jump to conclusions about her being wrong. And going off that last point, perhaps the biggest retcon in this movie is the fact that McGonagall was teaching at Hogwarts in 1927, and before that in 1910, when she wasn't born until 1935. This is probably the hardest one to explain, but there is a fan theory out there that the necklace she was wearing is a time turner. I actually tweeted about this myself, and a lot of people seem to agree, but I'm not going to speculate too much on this. However, all of these things that people think are retcons could very well be plot points for the future. I mean, look at how far ahead she looked for the original Harry Potter books. There are so many examples of this in her writing, like Snape's arc, which he knew from day one, or the vanishing cabinet that Harry hid in the second book that ended up being what Draco used in the 6th book, and so much more. The difference between the original 7 books and these films is, I'm sad to say, the internet. It's full of people who have an easy way to complain or call Rowling out, which was not the case when the original series came out. But I'm sure that people would have pointed out flaws from the original series before the series ended that were then answered when the series wrapped up. There were so many loose ends that Rowling had to tie up in the Deathly Hallows, and had it been released in modern day, she would have been roasted the same way she is here. Since the release of The Crimes of Grindelwald, Rowling has stated that in the 3rd film, answers are given, and to be patient. I believe that all of this will be explained and has been planned for a long time. I mean, just look at how she knew about Nagini's past 20 years ago. This is a tweet that got a lot of hate, but if you guys just looked a little deeper, you'd see that she explained exactly how she planned this, saying that the name Nagini comes from the Naga, a mythical creature that are sometimes depicted as half human, half snake, hence Nagini being a maledictus, someone who turns from human to snake. Now let's go on to the next point. Another one of the biggest complaints about this movie is that it's confusing. J.K. Rowling wrote this screenplay, and she's no stranger to writing. She is one of the most successful writers in history. However, she garnered this reputation by writing books, not movies. I think she had a lot of help when writing the first Fantastic Beasts movie, because at the time, she was new to the style of writing. That screenplay was written in a way that made it really easy to adapt into a movie. However, what I think happened with The Crimes of Grindelwald was she was given free rein to write whatever and however she wanted with no help whatsoever. And I think she wrote a good story, but it was written more as a book than a film, which is where I think a lot of the confusion comes in. She no longer has the freedom to explain each detail as it happens, she has to show it. And that's not something that she excels at, the best example being the tiny shot of Credence still being alive. I think that The Crimes of Grindelwald is the opposite of The Cursed Child, and if you're a constant viewer on my channel, you know it's sort of become a running joke that I bash on this play. The Cursed Child is a terrible story with good execution on stage, while The Crimes of Grindelwald is a good story with bad execution on the big screen. It was not written in a way that would allow it to be successful on the big screen, so when people say that they're confused, I'll agree, this is a valid argument. there are things that many people did not understand, and granted, some of the confusion came from the so-called retcons, most notably the final scene, but a lot of confusion also stems from more simple things. One example is the bird that Credence has. Credence, and we as an audience, are supposed to believe it to be a raven, which would of course tie him to the Lestrange family, as we learned in the flashback that the raven is the family's crest, which is a really cool detail, but unfortunately, a lot of people did not pick up on this rather important and interesting plot point. There's also the importance and symbolism of the raven and the phoenix, the raven depicting the Lestrange family, and the phoenix representing the Dumbledore family. But this went over so many people's heads because it just wasn't well represented. There's also the detail of who Nicholas Flamel was talking to in the book. When looking at the screenplay, there are two very interesting details that are just completely lost when translated to film. First, Flamel looks at Dumbledore's picture and he's not there, meaning that Dumbledore is off doing something. And two, nobody knew who he talked to in the book.
What's happening?
It was actually a woman named Eulalie Hicks, who is a professor at Ilvermorny, the American version of Hogwarts. These are such cool details that just get totally lost and make the movie confusing. But it goes to show that had this been a book, it would have been far less confusing and probably far more interesting for fans. And unfortunately, I think that's one of the reasons why this film is so disliked. It just doesn't adapt well to the big screen, but the story is there. The flashbacks in the movie are the prime example of this, and this brings us into the writing structure section of the video. The confession of Leta and Kama, or the flashbacks of Leta and Newt's days at Hogwarts, were not written in the way that they should have been. They were written more like Hagrid's telling of his journey with the Giants in the Order of the Phoenix, or Aberforth's telling of his sibling's story and the death of his sister in the Deathly Hallows. They're both pretty long stories, but it works because being in a novel, it allows it to sort of take over the main story for a while. While in a movie, if a story is being told, it's always looked at as more of a flashback, rather than a story inside of a story. This makes these multiple scene flashbacks feel sort of out of place. That being said, these flashbacks were incredibly compelling and heart-racing, but unfortunately, the way in which it was delivered once again made the good story lost in translation. The best way to make this sort of style work is to have a constant back and forth between past and present, much like the Daredevil Netflix series, or even in Arrow when they flash back and forth from the present to Oliver's days on the island. It's a constant theme, and the story is written to complement these kinds of flashbacks. But The Crimes of Grindelwald didn't have that. It was just one flashback with all of the scenes shown at once, instead of spreading them out throughout the movie. And this brings us to another huge complaint this movie gets about its writing, people saying that Rowling structured this movie weirdly. This opinion was popularized by a YouTube channel called The Closer Look, in a video that has garnered a lot of attention at almost 1 million views. The whole point of their video is them pointing out that this movie has no second act, just Act 1, or the introduction, and Act 3, or the climax, where the big ending takes place. 3-act structures are what most stories are based around.
The first act takes up the first quarter of the movie, the second act takes up the middle half of the movie, and the third act takes up the last quarter.
The Closer Look's argument is that without an Act 2, there's no rising action, meaning the thing that builds as we get closer and closer to the climax. He says that the climax of the film is the scene with Grindelwald's rally, and that nothing really built to this. However, he's missing the entire point of the story. The story's climax isn't just the scene with Grindelwald, that's just the second half of the climax. The beginning of the climax is the confession of Leta Lestrange. And this changes everything, and pretty much negates everything this YouTube channel says. I'm going to explain why this is the case. The Crimes of Grindelwald climax is similar to the climax in the Chamber of Secrets. Harry going down to the chamber is the start of the climax for the book, just as everyone going to the Lestrange family vault is the start of the climax in the Crimes of Grindelwald. But the beginning of the climax is all exposition, and it's just a back and forth between the two characters. Then, the end of the climax is Harry fighting the basilisk and destroying the diary. Much like in the Crimes of Grindelwald, the end of the climax is Grindelwald's speech and the whole showdown with the flames. The climax doesn't have to be all action, and seeing Leta's confession as the climax adds up pretty nicely when you break it down. So I'm gonna do just that. Throughout the entire film, the arc of Leta is present. In every beat of this movie, Leta's past always comes up, everyone thinking that Credence is her long-lost brother. It's mentioned early on in Dumbledore and Newt's conversation.
A baby whom everyone thought lost? Not Leta's brother, that's what they're whispering.
It's mentioned by Yusuf Kama in his conversation with Tina. It's mentioned when Travers visits Hogwarts and talks with Dumbledore. It's mentioned in the flashback of Lita in school. It's mentioned when Dumbledore and Lita have their conversation. And it's touched upon when Theseus and Lita talk.
They think that Credence boy might be your missing brother.
My brother is dead. He died.
I know.
How many times,
And
Theseus?
the records will prove that.
And on top of that, everybody is after this family tree. We see Grindelwald's followers break in to get it. We see Newt and Tina try to get it, and right after that, we see Lita try to get it. And all of this leads them to the Lestrange family vault where the climax begins. Not to mention the constant theme of ravens throughout the movie, the emblem that we know as the Lestrange family crest. This is the rising action. The rising action is all of these scenes of people talking about Lita's past. This is what the whole story has been leading up to. We've been getting clue after clue, and Lita's confession is the climax we were waiting for.
Corvus Lestrange is already dead. I killed him.
I actually love this as a climax because, as I said earlier in the video, I find Lita to be one of the most compelling characters in this film, and she might just be my favorite character in this movie.
You never met a monster you couldn't love.
The closer look says that there is no second act, and all that's in the middle of the movie where the second act should be is exposition scenes with the flashback and Dumbledore's conversation with Lita. He says these scenes serve no purpose and are worthless scenes that add nothing to the story.
This scene fundamentally serves no purpose. It does nothing to advance the plot, it doesn't deliver any exposition, this scene is irrelevant.
But it was right in front of him. The reason why these exposition scenes are in the middle of the film where the second act and the rising action should be is because it's the second act and the rising action. He says that the flashbacks are worthless because we already know of Lita and Newt's relationship. But that wasn't the point of these flashbacks. The point was having the audience see Lita's big fear, which we find out is the death of her little brother. The two scenes in question that the closer look says are irrelevant are some of the most vital when it comes to Lita's past. In these scenes, we get our first hints that Lita despises herself for something she did to her younger brother Corvus, the plot point that we've been hearing about over and over again. And because of this, you hang on to every word, desperate to know what happened to her brother. But again, we don't get the answer, which only makes the rise in action even stronger, and makes us want to know the truth even more. So this makes Lita's confession what the whole movie leads to. We finally get all the answers. A climax doesn't have to be all action, just as we saw in the Chamber of Secrets. You can even look at the Goblet of Fire, where half of the climax is Voldemort explaining how he survived and how he made it back to the living. The climax starts in the graveyard, but a good chunk of the climax is Voldemort speaking to his Death Eaters and giving us a rapid amount of information while in full swing of the climax. Looking at Voldemort's speech and Lita's confession, it's almost exactly the same in delivery and the amount of information we get. And this again goes with what I said about Rowling writing this more like a novel than a screenplay. She has this style that's perfect for novels, but doesn't quite translate to a script. The story is there though. Nevertheless, those that bash this film for not having a second act, they completely missed the point of the story. Moving on to the next point. Another very constant complaint that I saw for this film was the fact that it's a bridge story, and what that means is, it's sort of useless. It's just a way to get us from movie 1 to movie 3, with nothing important really happening. My argument for this is simply going to be listing very crucial things that this movie delivered. Lita's sacrifice that will change the entire future of the series, Queenie joining Grindelwald and breaking up the four main heroes, Newt developing, going from not hugging his brother or picking a side, to being the one to initiate the hug and telling Theseus that he was on his side now, finding out about the blood pact between Dumbledore and Grindelwald, the real reason why Dumbledore can't go after Grindelwald himself, Grindelwald's brilliant speech, getting many of his supporters to take his side even more, and turning them against the orders in the ministry that killed a fellow follower. And on top of that, Grindelwald telling his followers to spread the word of the ministry's violence, a monumental act that will turn the tides of the war.
Go forth from this place and spread the word. It is not we who are violent.
Both Nagini and Jacob losing the person they love to the bad guy, something that might go on to change the person Nagini is, possibly leading her to join Voldemort in the future, Nicholas Flamel finally seeing action after 200 years, and just simply the introduction of the audience seeing Nicholas Flamel for the first time, and finally, seeing Credence join Grindelwald after waiting 2 whole movies for him to do so. So yeah, there's a lot in this movie that is pretty important to the whole series. It's not just a bridge story. And the final complaint that I'll go over that I saw a lot, but in my opinion is kind of dumb. that there aren't enough beasts even though the title of the series is Fantastic Beasts. Well, there are 28 different beasts in this movie, including a whole circus of creatures. We saw how useful and vital many of these creatures are to the plot. And we got our first look at a Maledictus and the snake that went on to be loyal to Voldemort and eventually became one of his Horcruxes. And come on, how could you not love the baby Nifflers? I'll admit, this movie has its problems, but what movie doesn't? I feel like a lot of the hate stems from a lack of discipline with the writing style. I think they gave Rowling too much freedom in a writing style that she hasn't quite mastered yet. In my opinion, I enjoyed this film. Everyone gave a great performance. I loved the dark tone this movie had, which separates it from the original series, while still having a few things that bring us back to Harry's story. The reveal of Hogwarts was epic. The movie expanded a great deal on the Wizarding World outside of what we had already come to know. The cinematography in this movie was pretty fantastic. And overall, I think it's a pretty solid storyline. Sure, there are some things you can nitpick here and there, but I don't think this movie deserves the amount of hate it gets. I went over the biggest complaints that people have for this movie, and my hope is that this video will shed some light on why those points might be sort of invalid or too harsh. And hopefully this video made you see that the Crimes of Grindelwald isn't as bad as everybody says.
Thank you so much for watching, guys. You can follow me on social media to see more of my personal life and more of this little dude. If you like this video, hit that like button and subscribe. I want to give a huge shout out to all my patrons listed below. If you want to be featured on the next video, plus get a bunch of other rewards, become a patron today. Again, thank you so much for watching, and look out for more great Movie Flame videos on the way.